A multitude of inhabitants walked one after another. Women walked burdened with packages and sacks on their heads. Mothers dragged children after them. Occasionally, warning shots were heard. Occasionally, you encountered a piercing look from one of the youngsters in the column, and the look said, "We have not yet surrendered. We shall return to fight you." During May through June, Ben-Gurion appears to have developed an obsession regarding Lydda and Ramla. Repeatedly, he jotted down in his diary that Lydda and Ramla had to be destroyed. In mid-June, he spoke in cabinet of the need to remove these two thorns. Operation Dani was the innocent-sounding code name for the attack on the two Palestinian towns of Lydda and Ramla, located roughly halfway between Jaffa and Jerusalem. In July 1948, the two Palestinian towns of Lydda and Ramla had a combined population of some 70,000 people. Sitting outside of the areas allocated to the new Jewish state by partition, there was some reason to believe they'd be spared. All hope was soon shattered when on the 10th of July 1948, Air Force jets slammed bombs into them. Operation Dani headquarters informed the Israeli Defense Forces General Staff of a general and serious civilian flight from Ramla. There is great value in continuing the bombing. Headquarters ordered more bombs, including incendiaries. A raid the following afternoon saw a young Lieutenant Colonel Moshe Dayan leading armored cars and jeeps belonging to the 89th Commando Battalion into Lydda. Rolling from east to west, their mounted guns sprayed machine gun fire at anything that moved. A trooper known only as Gideon described the atmosphere in the town. "I kill everyone who belongs to the enemy camp, man, woman, old person, child, and I am not deterred." The Yiftah Brigade's 89th Battalion was closely followed by the 3rd Battalion, who were ordered to shoot any clear target or anyone seen on the streets. Keith Wheeler, reporting for the Chicago Sun-Times, watched the day's events unfold. As he'd describe it, practically everything in their way died. Riddled corpses lay by the roadside. Kenneth Bilby of the New York Herald Tribune additionally described Lydda's streets, with corpses of Arab men, women, and even children strewn about in the wake of the ruthlessly brilliant charge. Desperate and deserted by the Arab Legion, the men of Lydda took refuge in the Dahmash Mosque in the city center, armed with some old rifles. After a few hours of fighting, they surrendered, only to be massacred inside the mosque by the Israeli forces. Palestinian sources recount that in the mosque and in the streets nearby, where the Jewish troops went on yet another rampage of murder and pillage, 426 men, women, and children were killed. The situation could have been vastly different in neighboring Ramla, where a delegation of notables from the town signed a formal instrument of surrender. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Yishuv, traveled to nearby Yazur and sought counsel from a group of military commanders. Stepping out for a cigarette, he was joined by Palma commander Yigal Alon and Operation Dani chief of operations Yitzhak Rabin. Alon reportedly asked, "What shall we do with the Arabs?" Ben-Gurion responded with a dismissive, energetic gesture with his hand and said, "Expel them." Within minutes, 2 orders were issued to the Yiftah Brigade headquarters. The inhabitants of Lydda must be expelled quickly without attention to age, and implement immediately. Signed, Yitzhak Rabin. Similarly for Ramla, Kiryati Brigade headquarters were tasked with emptying of the town of its inhabitants. Rabin, who oversaw the operation at Lydda, would later write, "The population did not leave willingly. There was no way of avoiding the use of force and warning shots in order to make the inhabitants march the 10 to 15 miles to the point where they would meet up with the Legion." Aside from the initial bloodbaths in the towns, more would succumb to dehydration and exhaustion. Many hundreds more died in the refugee camps in Ramallah shortly after the Exodus. In all, probably about 1,000 Arab civilians died during and immediately after the expulsion from Lydda Ramla. By the middle of the month, there were still hundreds of unburied corpses littering Lydda's streets and houses and the road between Lydda and Ramla. Initially, at least, the corpses posed a political problem, and on the 14th of July, Dani headquarters instructed the Kiryati Brigade to evacuate all the refugees and to get rid of the corpses. The troops apparently wouldn't remedy the problem since, a day later, IDF Medical Corps Dr. Klaus Dreyer complained to IDF General Staff that the bodies were still there and posed a moral and aesthetic issue. Benny Morris is perhaps Israel's leading historian. His works undoubtedly produced a well of information that upended the long-held and apparently still held conventional wisdom of 1948. His legacy is helpfully summarized by none other than Norman Finkelstein, something of a rival of his. Morris has indisputably produced landmark studies. He has permanently redefined the parameters of legitimate scholarly debate on the origins of the Palestinian refugee problem, dispatching to oblivion the standard Israeli claims about Arab broadcasts. Arab broadcasts refers to the notion that the Arab High Committee and national committees and all the major radio stations in, say, Damascus and Cairo, had called on the Palestinians to leave in order to make way for the advancing Arab armies. Finkelstein cites Christopher Hitchens as a typical example. Haj Amin Husseini called upon the Arabs to leave in view of the invasion of the Arab armed forces in 1948. This brought the first disaster on the Palestinians and created the Palestinian refugee problem. Morris cites none other than the intelligence service of the Haganah, the precursor to the Israeli Defense Forces. Indeed, about a month and a half before the Arab armies invaded, the Haganah intelligence service reported that the Arab High Committee was no longer approving exit permits for fear of causing panic in the country. And on March 31st, a Galilee Haganah intelligence service officer was reporting, "Every Arab leaving the country is regarded as a traitor and would be put on trial in Syria. Everyone wishing to leave the country had to obtain permission from the Arab National Committee in Haifa." Further, the Haganah intelligence service surmised that it was this spate of orders that prompted Syria and Lebanon to close their borders to refugees toward the end of March. Indeed, the Arab department of the Haganah intelligence service accurately summarized the attitude and policies of the AHC toward the exodus during the first months of the war. The Arab institutions tried to combat the phenomenon of flight and evacuation and to curb the waves of emigration. The AHC decided to adopt measures to weaken the flight by restrictions, punishments, threats, propaganda in the newspapers, radio, etc. Michael Palumbo cites the Palestinian press, which frequently carried stories that violently criticized those who fled the country. On March 30th, the Palestinian newspaper Al-Shab referred to the disgraceful exodus of those who were quitting their villages bag and baggage. Other stories referred to the refugees as a fifth column and traitors. Perhaps also noteworthy is the fact that these broadcasts occur well before any Arab invasion. In other words, it is clear that the exodus began before any Arab invasion. Put in another way, the exodus did not occur as a result of any Arab army's invasion. Immediately following the Israeli proclamation of independence and the deployment of the Arab armies to Palestine, King Abdullah of Jordan declared their mission: to protect unarmed Arabs against massacres similar to Deir Yassin. "Why should you go to Deir Yassin? We have no trouble with them," said Haganah commander in Jerusalem David Shaltiel. After all, the notables of Deir Yassin on January 20th, 1948, met with the leaders of Jerusalem's Jewish Givat Shaul neighborhood and agreed to mutual non-belligerency. In fact, they appear to have even collaborated with them. Despite the Haganah commander's puzzlement, he seemed happy to oblige the requests of the Irgun and the notorious Stern Gang. "You have permission, but you should know that we've had no trouble with these Arabs till now." Because of the prior agreement they had signed with the village, the Haganah decided to send the Irgun and Stern Gang troops so as to absolve themselves from any official accountability. with the Stern Gang providing explosives, the Irgun arms from their clandestine arms shops, and the Haganah providing rifles and grenades. The combined forces set out for Deir Yassin, which inhabited a hill west of Jerusalem. The date was April 9, 1948. As they burst into the village, the Jewish soldiers sprayed the houses with machine gun fire, killing many of the inhabitants. The remaining villagers were then gathered in one place and murdered in cold blood, their bodies abused while a number of the women were and then killed. Zionist intelligence agents themselves described harrowing scenes, including Haganah intelligence commanding officer in Jerusalem, Yitzhak Levy. The conquest of the village was carried out with great cruelty. Whole families, women, old people, children, were killed. Some of the prisoners moved to places of detention, including women and children, were murdered viciously by their captors, as did Meir Pa'il, a spy for the Palmah, the elite Haganah unit. I saw with my own eyes several families that had been murdered with their women, children, and old people. Their corpses were lying on top of each other. The morning after, Jacques de Reynier, a Swiss doctor working for the International Red Cross, was informed of a massacre at Deir Yassin. Upon arrival, an Irgun officer warned him, "We're still mopping up." De Reynier describes a grisly scene. The mopping up had been done with machine guns, then hand grenades. It had been finished off with knives. Anyone could see that. Why did this fate befall the peaceful town of Deir Yassin? In the words of Ilan Pappé, Deir Yassin was doomed to be wiped out because it was within the areas designated in Plan Dalet to be cleansed. Contrary to the conventional history, the Zionist movement didn't accept the solution put forth by the 1937 Peel Commission. Only publicly did they accept the plan. In more private venues, the Zionist leaders understood any Jewish state, no matter its initial size, would be the first step on the road to conquering all of Palestine, as was always the plan. The British Foreign Office appears to have understood as much when their Eastern Department head George Randell wrote in a memo, "It has become clear that partition will not mean what we at first imagined, i.e., a separation of the Jewish and Arab spheres, but will mean the creation of a new jumping-off place for the Jews from which they will inevitably spread their influence over a much larger area." The Jews make no secret of this, and it has become clear that it is the main objection of the Arabs to the partition proposals. Of course, Ben-Gurion declared as much himself in June of 1938. "I favor partition of the country because when we become a strong power after the establishment of the state, we will abolish partition and spread throughout all of Palestine." An indication of Ben-Gurion's intentions with the subsequent 1947 partition. The pre-mandate history is illustrative of the Palestinian attitudes regarding the Zionist movement. Noteworthy are the words of Said al-Husseini from May of 1911. Al-Husseini was an Ottoman member of parliament representing Palestine who warned of Zionist expansionism early on. The Jews intend to create a state in the area that will include Palestine, Syria, and Iraq. Still before the mandatory period, 3 years later, Moshe Chertok, Ben-Gurion's chief aide and Israel's first foreign minister, spoke candidly. "We have not come to an empty land to inherit it, but we have come to conquer a country from a people inhabiting it." Of course, it was well known that Palestine was not a barren land without people inhabiting it, as described by Israel Zangwill, an early Zionist and close lieutenant to Theodor Herzl, Zionism's founding father. He acknowledged as early as 1905 that Palestine proper had already its inhabitants, and the province of Jerusalem is already twice as thickly populated as the United States, having 52 souls to the square mile, and not 25% of them Jews. No less important a figure in the Zionist movement than Chaim Weizmann, Israel's first president, would himself acknowledge the native population. In a comment to Arthur Rupin, head of the colonization department at the Jewish Agency, Weizmann said the following: "The British told us that there are some 100,000, and for those there is no value. And so, transfer became the agreed-upon solution. A number of revealing statements by the indisputable leader of the Zionist movement in the lead-up to the 1948 catastrophe are worthy of attention. Indeed, David Ben-Gurion made clear his feelings about transfer when he wrote, excitedly, in his diary, "The compulsory transfer of the Arabs from the valleys of the proposed Jewish state could give us something which we never had, an opportunity that we never dared to dream of in our wildest imaginings. National consolidation in an independent homeland." He was even more direct in a meeting with his Jewish agency executive 5 days later. "I support compulsory transfer. I don't see in it anything immoral." His underlings felt similarly, including Menachem Usishkin, president of the Jewish National Fund. In a statement to journalists in Jerusalem in 1930, Usishkin acknowledged not only that the land was heavily populated, but also that he wanted them removed. If there are other inhabitants there, they must be transferred to some other place. We must take over the land. We have a greater and nobler ideal than preserving several hundred thousands of Arab fellahin. Perhaps the most consistent, extreme, and obsessive advocate of compulsory transfer was Yosef Weitz, a Polish Jew who arrived in Palestine in 1908 and later became director of the settlement department of the Jewish National Fund and head of the Israeli government's official transfer committee of 1948. Weitz, who was a prolific diarist, wrote in December of 1940 that there is no way but to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, to transfer all of them. Not one village must be left, not one Bedouin tribe. The transfer must be directed at Iraq, Syria, and even Transjordan. And only after this transfer will the country be able to absorb millions of our brothers. There is no other solution. Upon visiting central Palestine in 1941, Weitz described large villages crowded in population and surrounded by cultivated land growing olives, grapes, figs, sesame, and maize fields. The 1937 Peel Commission's declared aim to transfer some 225,000 Palestinians off of the land allocated to the Jewish state to what would be part of neighboring Jordan was, to put it mildly, a deeply unpopular stipulation. After all, writes Noor Masalha of the University of London, the idea of transferring the Palestinians was a euphemism denoting the organized removal of the Arab population of Palestine to neighboring or distant countries. This was merely the logical conclusion of the dominant ideology of the Yishuv, Benny Morris writes. Transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism, because it sought to transform a land which was Arab into a Jewish state. As partition carved Palestine into two lopsided pieces, Menachem Begin, the commander of the Irgun, was anxious of the outcome. My greatest worry in those months was that the Arabs might accept the United Nations plan. Later, Ben-Gurion would make it clear to his cabinet that he had no intention of respecting the boundaries indicated in the partition resolution. United Nations resolutions are not compulsory, and we ought not to pin all our hopes and efforts on them. The dissatisfaction with the partition resolution is interesting given the privileges awarded to the Jewish minority, who had before owned just 6% of the land. Now they had 56%, comprising the most fertile land in the country, along with the only major port in all of Palestine, Haifa. Had the UN decided to make the territory the Jews had settled on in Palestine correspond with the size of their future state, they would have entitled them to no more than 10% of the land. Just days later, the Arab High Committee in Palestine declared a 3-day strike and an organized demonstration in protest of partition. Some of the demonstrations got out of hand and spilled over into Jewish business areas, as happened in Jerusalem, where demonstrators attacked Jewish shops and a market. Though these were the exception to the rule, as confirmed by Sir Alan Cunningham, the British High Commissioner in Palestine at the time. The initial Arab outbreaks were spontaneous and unorganized, and were more demonstrations of displeasure at the UN decision than determined attacks on Jews. The weapons initially employed were sticks and stones, and had it not been for Jewish recourse to firearms, it is not impossible that the excitement would have subsided and little loss of life been caused. This is more probable since there is reliable evidence that the Arab Higher Committee as a whole, and the Mufti in particular, although pleased at the strong response to the strike call, were not in favor of serious outbreaks. So said Palti Sela, an intelligence officer, among whose tasks was to report daily on the mood among and trends within the rural population of Palestine. The Palestinians, according to him, continued life as usual. Indeed, throughout the month of December 1947, Sela reported, "Normalcy is the rule and agitation the exception." And so, Zionist combatants felt compelled to act quickly, so as to avoid a sustained period of calm. Early examples of attacks on defenseless villages include Deir Ayyub, which had no defense mechanism of any kind. An easy target for 25 men to raid the village and bomb 3 houses. Just a day after the protests began, and well more than 5 months before the invasion of the neighboring Arab armies, Ben-Gurion reiterated his true feelings regarding the partition plan. It was a non-starter. There are 40% non-Jews in the areas allocated to the Jewish state. This composition is not a solid basis for a Jewish state. And we have to face this new reality with all its severity and distinctness. Such a demographic balance questions our ability to maintain Jewish sovereignty. Only a state with at least 80% Jews is a viable and stable state. The raid on Deir Ayyub would be an early model for a broad campaign to bring about this demographic change, though, as Yitzhak Rabin had revealed about the population of Lydda, the poor farmers of the country would not willingly leave their homes, their livelihoods, their safety, comfort, and security. In March of the new year, still months before the Arab army's invasion, the chiefs of the Haganah finalized their mega operation, the notorious Plan D, or Dalet in Hebrew. As Benny Morris would describe it, the essence of the plan was the clearing of hostile and potentially hostile forces. However, the Haganah regarded almost all the villages as actively or potentially hostile. From the text of the plan itself, these operations can be carried out in the following manner: either by destroying villages, by setting fire to them, by blowing them up, and by planting mines in their debris, and especially of those population centers which are difficult to control continuously, or by mounting combing and control operations according to the following guidelines: encirclement of the villages, conducting a search inside them. In case of resistance, the armed forces must be wiped out and the population expelled outside the borders of the state. Ilan Pappé explains why Plan Dalet indeed meant all villages. Villages were to be expelled in their entirety, either because they were located in strategic spots or because they were expected to put up some sort of resistance. These orders were issued when it was clear that occupation would always provoke some resistance and that therefore no village would be immune, either because of its location or because it would not allow itself to be occupied. This was the master plan for the expulsion of all the villages in rural Palestine. Further, each brigade commander received a list of the villages or neighborhoods that had to be occupied, destroyed, and their inhabitants expelled with exact dates. In all, 531 villages and 11 urban neighborhoods and towns were destroyed and their inhabitants expelled under the direct orders. Confirmed by none other than Ben-Gurion himself, writing approvingly on May 11th, that the cleansing of Palestine remained the prime objective of Plan Dalet. Aside from Deir Yassin, the fall of Haifa would be among the most significant moments precipitating the Nakba, or catastrophe, from 1947 to 1949. The de-Arabization of the city would be carried out under the guise of Operation Bi'ur Hametz, cleansing the leaven. The Hebrew term stands for total cleansing and refers to the Jewish religious practice of eliminating all traces of bread or flour from people's homes on the eve of Passover. Carmeli Brigade Operation Officer Mordechai Machlef gave the orders to his troops to kill any Arab you encounter, torch all inflammable objects, and force doors open with explosives. Machlef would later enjoy a major promotion: Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army. The Haganah, preempting the assault, stationed 3-inch Davidka mortars and let loose, raining down shells filled with 60 pounds of explosive each. Highly inaccurate, but producing such ear-splitting booms that Palestinians began pouring into the streets, trampling toward the gates of the port. In this way, the Davidkas proved to be a useful tool to precipitate flight, and so they would be used time and time again. Additionally, Zionist forces employed, said a British 1st Battalion Coldstream Guard situation report, completely indiscriminate and revolting machine gun fire, mortar fire, and sniping on women and children, sheltering in churches and attempting to get out. Psychological warfare was also a key component of the operation at Haifa, as well as throughout Palestine as a whole. These included, as recalled by Haganah officer Leo Hyman, jeeps with loudspeakers playing, quote, horror sounds, including shrieks, wails, and anguished moans of Arab women, the wail of sirens, and the clang of fire alarm bells, interrupted by a sepulchral voice calling out in Arabic, "Save your souls, all ye faithful, flee for your lives." Again, another key method to spurring panic and flight among the Palestinians, pursuant to Plan D. So many fleeing souls flooded the ships at Haifa's port, they capsized. Before November of 1947, Haifa had a Palestinian population numbering some 65,000. By mid-May, that number was a paltry 4,000, a testament to the scale of the operation. The resounding effects on neighboring communities further fueled panic over the terror that was to be delivered on their doorsteps. Safad would also meet the same fate in a campaign lasting from mid-April to May 1st. There were 1,000 well-trained Palma troops confronting 400 Arab volunteers, one of many local imbalances that show the falsity of the myth of a Jewish David facing an Arab Goliath in 1948. 100 elderly residents remained by the end, and still, on June 5th, Ben-Gurion noted in his diary that they had been expelled, each one to Lebanon. In Greater Jerusalem, Itzhak Levy, head of Haganah intelligence for the city, oversaw, as he put it, the cleansing of Kataman. Indeed, 8 Palestinian neighborhoods and 39 villages were ethnically cleansed in the Greater Jerusalem area, their population transferred to the eastern part of the city. The villages are all gone today. The ancient city of Acre faced a particularly vicious siege and cleansing effort, beginning in early May. The Zionist forces employed the usual procedure of mortar bombardment, though the city's inhabitants proved to be especially difficult to overcome. However, its exposed water supply 10 kilometers to the north proved its Achilles heel. Thus, typhoid germs were apparently injected into the water. The Red Cross reports describe a sudden typhoid epidemic and, even with their guarded language, point to outside poisoning as the sole explanation for the outbreak. By the time Acre was captured, on May 18th, 4,000 Palestinians remained out of a population of almost 50,000. In the final days of the mandate, Jaffa as well would fall, and it would again be an ugly crusade. With a pre-November 1947 population of some 80,000 people, Jaffa was the largest Palestinian city in the entire country. Its depopulation would constitute one of the major single tragedies of the Nakba. Beginning early, at 8 a.m. on the 26th of April, Irgun troops began shelling the city, this time using some 20 tons of ordnance. In a pre-attack briefing, Irgun head of operations Amihai Paglin laid out the objectives, which included causing chaos among the civilian population in order to cause a mass flight. Haganah intelligence reported a slaughter, in which Irgun troops left behind badly mutilated Arab corpses. The British commander at Jaffa, General Horatius Murray, appeared unsteady at the site. "I saw a scene which I never thought to see in my life. It was the sight of the whole population of Jaffa pouring out onto the road, carrying in their hands whatever they could pick up, moving as fast as their legs could carry them. It was a case of sheer terror." When Jaffa fell, its entire population was expelled. With the fall of Jaffa, the occupying Jewish forces had emptied and depopulated all the major cities and towns of Palestine. Worth noting is the fact that these most consequential occurrences of expulsion, which precipitated fear, panic, and flight among scores of other Palestinians, occurred before the mandate ended, before the proclamation of independence, and indeed before the invasion of any Arab military. Indeed, it was just between January of 1948 to May of that year that saw some 250,000 Palestinians forced from their homes. And then came the so-called War of Survival, the newborn Jewish state surrounded on all sides by rogue armies seeking its destruction. The month before the proclamation of independence and the subsequent offensive by the Arab armies, Ben-Gurion appeared to brag to his soon-to-be foreign minister Moshe Shertok that we can face all the Arab forces. We will be able not only to defend ourselves, but also to inflict death blows on the Syrians in their own country and take over Palestine as a whole. In public, however, Ben-Gurion warned of a, quote, second Holocaust. There was considerable hesitation by the Arab states to intervene in Palestine in view of their military weakness. Indeed, at the immediate outset of the Arab hostilities, the General George C. Marshall, then Secretary of State, gave a sobering assessment of the condition of the Arab forces. Famous from his role as Army Chief of Staff, he declared of Lebanon, "Lebanon has no real army. Syria has neither arms or an army worthy of the name. Iraq cannot afford to move more than a handful of troops, and Egypt," he said, "was marred by strikes and disorders, which made the country militarily weak." The strongest Arab army would be of no help, since they had colluded with Israel to keep their fighting front limited to Jerusalem. Indeed, Israel had agreed to cede the West Bank to the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan in exchange for relative peace on their border. This tacit agreement was not easy for the Zionists to accept, as it betrayed their expansionist principles. Many of them would later regret this decision and back the push to occupy the West Bank in the June 1967 war. But at the time, the Jordanian quid pro quo was very tempting indeed. Abdullah promised not to join any all-Arab military operations against the Jewish state. Though as a consequence, without the Jordanian army, the Arab Legion, the Arab world lacked all serious capacity to defend the Palestinians, though it's doubtful that their inclusion would have tipped the scale in the Arabs' favor. By May 1948, the Haganah had mobilized and deployed 35,780 troops, 5,000 to 10,000 more than the combined troop strength of the regular Arab armies. The Zionist forces also grew precipitously. The Haganah's successor, the IDF, by July 1948, had 63,000 men under arms. The capture by the 51st Battalion Givati Brigade of Sawafir al-Sharqiya and adjoining Sawafir al-Gharbiya just days after the end of the mandate is an enlightening case study. The subsequent operation order for C Company was typical, and its language ubiquitous. To expel the enemy from the villages, to clean the front line, to conquer the villages, to cleanse them of inhabitants, women and children should also be expelled, to take several prisoners, and to burn the greatest possible number of houses. The operation orders for the troops on the ground following the capture of Palestinian towns were replete with the words cleanse, to cleanse, cleansing. Ben-Gurion himself wrote gleefully in his diary for June 5th, "We occupied today Yibne. There was no serious resistance, and Qaqoon. Here, the cleansing operation continues." Though a pocket of the Galilee, comprising Palestine's northern region, would be allocated to the Palestinians in the partition plan, the Zionist forces moved swiftly in blitzkrieg fashion to capture the territory and expel nearly all of its inhabitants. The Palmah's northern commander, Yigal Allon, described anxiously awaiting the Galilee's expulsion, or, as he described it, he was eager to cleanse the Upper Galilee. Arab leaders would have been imprudent not to heed the sincere roars of outrage from their citizenry over the situation of the Palestinians. From April onward, They had heard continuous broadcasts retelling the atrocities committed at Deir Yassin, a defining moment of Arab fury over Zionist crimes. Indeed, King Abdullah echoed this sentiment when he declared that Arab armies were being sent into the frontier to protect unarmed Arabs against massacres similar to Deir Yassin. Lebanese Interior Minister Kamil Chamoun in turn declared another fear, which affected the Arab world more broadly. The establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine is merely the prelude to the establishment of a Jewish state in Syria, Lebanon, and Transjordan. Unfortunately, the Hashemite kingdom's betrayal of his countrymen, of the Arabs, and the Palestinians most of all, would ensure that more massacre would ensue, as they did over and over, in a bloody testament to the agony Palestinian families endured in their futile attempts to hold on to their homes and their lives. Atrocity was, as in all ethnic cleansing efforts, critical to instilling the mass waves of fear that propelled families to flee, taking nothing but the shirts on their backs. Aria Itzhaki, former director of the Israeli Army Archives, has taken a bold stance on the history, alleging that in almost every Arab village occupied by us during the War of Independence, acts were committed which are defined as war crimes, such as murders, massacres, and Yuri Milstein, the authoritative Israeli military historian of the 1948 war, goes one step further, maintaining that every skirmish ended in a massacre of Arabs. In a not-so-uncommon case, an order from Yigal Allon to the 3rd Battalion states, "You have to blow up 20 houses and kill as many warriors as possible." The operation was entrusted to the 3rd Battalion's deputy commander Moshe Kalman. Kalman's troops took the order to mean capturing the main street, attaching TNT to the houses, and blowing up one after the other while families were still sleeping inside. As Kalman himself later recalled, "We left behind 35 demolished houses and 60 to 80 dead bodies." A tale of bravery at Ain al-Zaytun as well ends in tragedy. It was there that on May the 1st, the elite Palmaz 3rd Battalion unleashed a mortar barrage and entered the town. Again, the townspeople were rounded up and shots fired over their heads as they ran. As many as 100, however, were taken prisoner. A Yusuf Ahmad Hajar stood up to the Palmaz soldiers, telling them, "We expect to be treated humanely." Additionally, he warned the soldiers that if they harmed the people of Ain Zaytun, the culprits would be punished by the Arab armies. The Palmaz soldiers were infuriated. One of the officers slapped Hajar and ordered his soldiers to choose 37 teenage boys at random. The teenagers were shot with their hands tied behind their backs. The events that unfolded in Dawaimeh are probably the worst in the annals of the Nakba atrocities. Dawaimeh was captured on the 29th of October of 1948 by the 89th Battalion, 8th Brigade. They encountered light resistance, per a report from the IDF's Southern Front. In the usual pattern, the troops stationed mortars and rained hellfire down on the town. 20 armored cars rolled in, firing machine guns, and surrounded Dawaimeh from 3 flanks, leaving one open to force out the terrified citizens. However, the inhabitants wouldn't leave, prompting the Israeli troops to enter the town and start going on a rampage. House to house, men, women, and children, as had been seen before. As rumors began to spread about the massacre afterward, Palma commander Yigal Allon ordered that the unit go to the village and bury with their own hands the corpses of those murdered. In the ensuing damage control, Yigal Yadin acknowledged that there had been a number of incidents like Deir Yassin. The town of Saliha saw the killing of as many as 94 persons taking refuge in a mosque. IDF blew it up with them inside, killing them all. In Safsaf, again, Israeli troops bombed the town, preempting an invasion, and on the morning of October 30th, the citizens were rounded up in the town square, where some 70 men were picked out and massacred and left out in the open. Although in the eyes of the Israeli army, men were all males between the ages of 10 and 50. The remaining civilians were then ordered to leave, made to run while IDF soldiers fired shots above their heads, the routine. It feels almost trivial naming these massacres and describing their execution. The reason being, of course, that the example of one town, however unimaginable, with the families murdered, separated, banished, and made to live in squalor in refugee camps, is but one tiny footnote in what was multiplied hundreds of times over. Besides instilling terror in the Palestinians and forcing them to run, the massacres also provided a collateral advantage for the Zionist forces, which they deemed to be a military edge against the Arab armies. What are they but human shields? As described in quite revolting verbiage, I might add, not surprisingly, by Zionist historian Benny Morris. The creation of the refugee columns, which for days cluttered the roads eastward, may have been one of the motives for the expulsion decision, since cluttering the main axes deep into Arab territory with human flotsam would severely hamper the legion. As evidenced by a Palma report, probably written by Allon soon after, which stated that the exodus, besides relieving Tel Aviv of a potential long-term threat, had, quote, clogged the legion's routes of advance. The misery of being bombarded, rounded up, and killed, the rest being made to march, sometimes even to exhaustion and death, was not alleviated once they made it to Lebanon or Jordan. Kenneth Bilby of the New York Herald Tribune would visit, early on, the refugee camps that hastily sprung up in the Jordanian-held West Bank. The tent camp in the Jordan Valley on the approach to Jericho had perhaps 20,000 inhabitants. He described their living conditions: brush for mattresses, a torn blanket or two. To eat, a pinch of meal, a pat or two of lard. The camp was talking about an Arab businessman from Haifa. The day before, he had taken his 2 sons from behind the tent, shot them through the head, and turned the gun on himself. They took his home and business, refused to allow his return even to liquidate. He was penniless and couldn't stand watching his children's bellies bloat. Millions still today, as a result of the catastrophe in 1948, are condemned to a life of poverty in the various refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, and of course, worst of all, Gaza, where the vast majority, some 70%, are refugees. The ethnic cleansing of the Negev and the coast north of Gaza City provided their current population. A densely crammed enclave was naturally the birthplace of a persistent resistance. One Ahmad Yassin, of course, was born in the now depopulated and destroyed Al-Jura near Ashkelon. Just a boy, he fled to Gaza with his family, made to be refugees in the Al-Shati camp. Perhaps this may shed light on his political motivations when he founded the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas. Through attacking and massacring people in towns and cities, expelling their inhabitants, and blowing up the houses so they had nothing to return to, the State of Israel was created. The consequences are still apparent in the form of apartheid, continued ethnic cleansing, and genocide. In the territory conquered by Israel, in which provided the foundation for the new state, some 90% of the population were expelled. Interestingly enough, when, according to the U.S. State Department, 90% of the Kosovar Albanian population were expelled from Kosovo, the U.S. government referred to this as ethnic cleansing. In doing so, they say, the Serbian forces employed such measures as forcible displacement, looting, widespread burning of homes, use of human shields, detentions, and summary executions. Israel's new state comprised nearly 80% of Palestine, far more than the 56% granted to them by the 1947 partition. This remaining 20%, contrary to the presuppositions framing the so-called peace process, is not Palestine, but just a small fraction. That the Palestinians would be willing to concede so much, 80% of their country, is, I feel confident to say, remarkable. Such as in 1976, when a resolution with the backing of Egypt and Syria, Israel's mortal enemies, called for an independent Palestinian state based on the pre-June 1967 borders, again just 20% of the country, and further a tacit recognition of Israel, vetoed by the United States to no one's surprise. Or 2002, when the entire Arab League unanimously adopted a two-state solution based on the pre-June 1967 borders, or 20% of the country, and not only recognition of Israel, but normalized relations. The proposal was again reaffirmed in 2007. Or in 2011, when Hamas Deputy Foreign Minister Ghazi Hamad told NPR that Hamas had accepted a two-state solution based on the 1967 20% of Palestine borders many, many times. Apparently doomed to fail each time, as the Palestinians wish to alleviate the suffering I've described among millions of Palestinians today, i.e. a return to the land they were expelled from, is not even allowed to be mentioned by Israeli negotiators. Indeed, a law was even passed in 2001 by the Knesset, making it illegal, called the Law for Safeguarding the Rejection of the Right of Return. And so, no so-called peace process or initiative even pretends to consider this most basic and fundamental injustice, especially one for which the United Nations had passed a resolution, 194, to resolve, a resolution calling for the unconditional return of the refugees to their homes. The UN had endorsed the plan posthumously after its chief architect, Count Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish Red Cross recipient for saving Jews from Nazi Germany, was assassinated by the Stern Gang on September 17, 1948. Though the Americans and British had endorsed Bernadotte's plan and had been eager to resolve the refugee issue, they ultimately sided with the Jewish state's commitment to never allowing the Palestinians to return, a consequence of the two countries' powerful Israel lobbies. Had it not been for highly effective pressure by the Zionist lobby on President Harry Truman, the course of Palestine's history could have run very differently. Instead, the Zionist sections of the American Jewish community learned an important lesson about their ability to impact American policy in Palestine, and later beyond in the Middle East as a whole.